Hello, welcome to this video. On this video I'm going to be reacting to a video recently posted by a YouTuber called Nari Sol, which is entitled Is Chopin Jazz? And if you look at the thumbnail then says yes and no. So I think the argument here is that Chopin is not necessarily a jazz musician, but he plays a pivotal role in the development of jazz because of some of the stuff he's doing sounds very similar to what jazz musicians are doing. It's an excellent video. It's full of incredible material. It's got some really well-researched explorations into the sort of harmonic structures that Chopin used and how they are then utilised in jazz. The video then breaks down those techniques, compositional techniques, into different areas. It starts off looking at melodic lines, and it talks about enclosure. And enclosure is a method using composition where when you are targeting a note, rather than going straight to the note, you enclose it by going to the note above or the note below, or very often the note above or the note below, and then you land on the note. And once you start to explore the idea of enclosure and chromaticism, and chromaticism is where you compose using all 12 notes. So an example of a chromatic melody would be that circus tune that goes that that's like a chromatic lead into that note at the end. Now it's a brilliant video. It's full of incredible playing. They're really knowledgeable. Nari Sol, if that's what her name is a phenomenal musician. It's well put together. It's absolutely fantastic, and I have no reason to criticise the video whatsoever. But when I watched it, it does it throws up a number of thoughts in my mind. And one of the things that it seems quite apparent to me is the way that it deals with jazz history. When we go back and look at early jazz, and there's a wonderful diagram that appears in this video where you see sort of all the great innovators of jazz, and it goes back to a point somewhere around about 1860 when Chopin was active, 1860, 1870, and it points there and says maybe we need to put Chopin there, which would place Chopin as the sort of originator of jazz, one of the founding fathers of jazz. Now, of course, that doesn't feel right, does it, to say Chopin is, and I don't think it's right at all. And so I want to explore that in more detail. Now, when we go back to that period of history in American music, it is a mystery. There's mythologies that have emerged around that. You know, historians are trying to work out what went on, but they're not too sure. And the reason is because folk forms aren't written down. Those music forms aren't written down, so we can't go back and read a score to see what was going on. Folk forms turn into popular music, which then turns into the music business in the 20th century once you could record them. And of course people loved folk forms, so they loved listening to that sort of music, so they bought those recordings. Jazz occupies a very special place in its innovation. And I think sometimes, because the history has been rewritten through a sort of contemporary lens, it actually misses the incredible innovation of jazz. All right. Now, I think there's a number of reasons for this, but let's just talk at it from a sort of the average YouTube jazz fan, jazz musician. You know, let's look at it from their perspective. So nowadays, most musicians' journey towards jazz is not the same as the journey that Louis Armstrong or Jelly Roll Morton had, right? Usually people start playing music, they're classically trained, or they come from a sort of rock music, pop music background. And as they start to study the instrument, they then gravitate toward jazz, or they hear jazz and they start to look at it and go, oh my god, this is really, really complex. You know, this is like really, really difficult music to play. Here I am playing a tune with 3 chords, and you know, if I want to take an in solo, I can just use a pentatonic scale. And now these guys aren't doing that. this is far more complex. I need to learn a lot more complex scales, arpeggios. I need to study how these melodic lines work. I've got to get into these weird chords because they got like, you know, minor 7 flat 5s and half diminished. They're the same chord, by the way. And I've got all these weird chords in there, and it's like I've got to study these chords and harmony and work out, and there's all this stuff. And so for the average student, the thing that's a shock about jazz is having to learn all this theory. Okay, so for many musicians, their first experience of hitting that theory is when they hit jazz. This is especially true of non-classical musicians. I'm one of those musicians. You know, I started playing music because I got into Motorhead and Iron Maiden. And then as I got into this, my dad had a whole bunch of jazz record collections, which I couldn't stick when I was a kid. You know, I grew up listening to it all, but I wanted to listen to rock. And then suddenly, you know, I'm trying to learn, say, how to play drums, and I'm checking out some of my dad's jazz drummers. I'm going, oh my God, this is really hard. It's harder than the rock stuff. Why is it? And you suddenly realise that there's this incredible technique in there. There's a skill level. There's a compositional level. There's a harmonic and melodic sophistication. Now, where is that coming from? Now, at the beginning of this video, they say it quite straight. They say jazz, and it's very simplistic, but it says jazz is a mixture of European harmonic, you know, approaches with African rhythms, right? Now, I think you could criticise both of those, and I'm going to on this video because I think that definition is poor. But of course, if you are admitting that the harmony comes from classical music, European classical music, well, that's why these jazz musicians sound like Chopin. It's not that Chopin's the originator of jazz. It's the fact that there are certain elements in jazz that were already established. Jazz didn't reinvent the wheel. What it does is it took the wheel and it made it into something incredibly new, like a hovercraft. That's what jazz does, and I think the contemporary history denies the great innovation of jazz. And I really want to try and get into this on this video. So, of course, the two musicians that are named are Art Tatum and Charlie Parker. They were both great innovators in the field of jazz. They were also incredible virtuosos, right? Now, to me, it's quite obvious that if you're Art Tatum, right, Art Tatum isn't some blues pianist playing by ear. He is playing by ear because he was blind. He wasn't completely blind, but he was partially blind. But what you had with Art Tatum was an incredible genius, a musical genius that could hear stuff. He most likely had perfect pitch. He could recognise stuff on sight, and he knew how to take that and integrate that. Now, the idea that a pianist at that technical level, when they were developing, did not play Chopin seems preposterous to me. Chopin was a virtuoso pianist in the sort of romantic period of classical music, right? He was playing and taking influences like from classical music, but also popular songs, waltzes. He's taking from that material, and in a way, that sort of catchy, hooky material that was around in the Victorian era actually has quite straight chord forms that have almost come from like hymns, you know. And they make this point. They say that the chords are very step by step, as you have in jazz. Well, again, that's because jazz is coming from that, right? The thing about Chopin was he was a virtuoso musician, and it was most likely he could improvise as well as any great jazz musician, but without recording, we wouldn't be able to hear that. Now, that's true of most of the great musicians. Beethoven and Mozart were most likely incredible improvisers, and if they had recording around that time, their recordings would have been different. In fact, musicians have improvised since the beginning of time. Right, the very first music that was ever played by human beings was improvised. No ancient man was, walking through the savannah one day and saw a score to some piece of music, then picked it up and started playing it. Music starts in improvisation. Improvisation is not an innovation of jazz, right? Enclosure, 2-5-1 chord progressions, half diminished scales, the use of the melodic minor, over dominant chords, altered dominant chords, all this stuff that stumps jazz students does not come from jazz. That is not the innovation of jazz. It's to be expected. right? The big question is why popular music, the music that most musicians start off with before they move to jazz, why does that not contain that, right? And the reason for that is because popular music of the 20th century is based upon folk songs to some extent, but the blues, right? And I'm going to come back to the blues in a minute, right? So let's just go back to the history of jazz. There is a big campaign at the moment, probably best illustrated by the BAM movement, Nicholas Payton's idea, the New Orleans trumpet player, of not calling jazz jazz, but calling it black American music. Okay, and so it almost goes without saying that obviously jazz is a black American music form. You know, it was created by black people, so it's a black American music form. Now, I have thought this all my life, and if you go to early videos on this channel, you will hear me saying that. That's a dogma. That's a dogma that we all say. My problem is in doing this channel, I am continually reading about the history of music and continually reading about the history of jazz. And when you start to look at the elements of jazz, you start to realise that a lot of the elements within jazz come from elsewhere. That actually jazz is incredible because it didn't exist before. There's elements in jazz that are completely new, and you start to go, well, why are those things new? It's obviously the integration of all these things. So what is it an integration of? Well, primarily I would say marching music. Why would it be marching music? Well, marching music was a big thing in the 19th century, but what exacerbates that is in the South, you had a civil war, okay? And the Civil War had loads of marching instruments, snare drums, clarinets, you know, cornets. And when the war was over and the African Americans were freed, okay, those instruments were dumped into second-hand shops, pawn shops and all that type of thing, so that musicians could buy those easily, right? And all sorts of musicians started to take those instruments on, and in a place like New Orleans, there was a big boom in marching music, which was there to play at parties and parades and all these types of things. That jazz is basically comes out of marching music, right? The front line of the clarinet, trombone, and cornet, and then backed up by a snare drum and a bass drum banging away, maybe some cymbals clashing together, you know, and the ability to walk while you're doing that, march, and when you march in 2/4 time, 1, 2. Of course, we have one of the great American composers in Sousa. So Sousa's churning out all these marches. People are playing marches. But obviously, jazz is more than marches, isn't it? There's a rhythm. Now, in this video, it states that those are African rhythms. I don't think they're African rhythms. There is a video where Branford Marsalis gets asked this. He goes, where does the rhythm come from jazz? And he says it comes from the Pentecostal beat, the church. Oh, praise the Lord. And that again is coming from hymns, and that has its feet in the African American experience, the gospel, you know, church world, right? Which again is something that was foisted on them when they were brought from Africa as slaves hundreds of years before. So that in itself is something that is not pure. That's something that's created out of it. And of course, within that rhythm, you have the distant memory of this of African rhythms. It's in there. But to say the jazz groove, the beat, that two, to say that is an African rhythm, I don't think is completely true. It's more nuanced than that. Now you can say, yeah, but you're picking it. Why do you want to get into it? It's obviously there's some, you know, influence of African rhythms in there. So why do you want to question that? And I'll tell you why. It's because slaves that were brought from Africa to South America were allowed to carry on playing their music. And when you listen to Latin American music, you hear a direct, obvious integration of Spanish folk songs and African music. You can hear the 3/2 polyrhythms. You can actually hear in the congas and the cowbells and the shakers. Those are all evolved directly from the instruments that are from Africa. So if anyone thinks, oh, why has Andy got this sort of a campaign of trying to make out that, you know, jazz isn't black, right? Which I'm not trying to do at all. I'm trying to get to something much more nuanced. But if you said Latin American music, I'll go straight down the line. You know, the rhythmical part of Latin American music, of samba and salsa, comes directly from Africa. The incredible thing about jazz is you have to factor in the African American experience into it, right? That slavery was very particular in the US of A, in that their very culture was taken away. And so what you have is a distant memory. You know, New Orleans is very famous for Congo Square, you know, where, American slaves were allowed to, you know, go back to these ancient sort of ritualistic voodoo in a way, because in that part of America, there was that influence as well. That's in there. And without a doubt, that is in there, right? But it's not straight, and that's why jazz rhythms, you know, the jazz swing and the syncopation, and then when you get later on the phrasing, the sort of all that stuff, which is an innovation, is not just African rhythms that have been integrated. Now, in terms of the harmony is, as we can see, is coming from European harmony. It's coming in through folk songs, it's coming in through classical music, it's coming in through marches, it's coming in through hymns, right? Now, if we look at the instrumentation, as I've said, early jazz is played on marching instruments. It's not anymore. Now it's played on, if you've got a double bass, that's come from an orchestra. If you've got an electric guitar, that's a 20th century innovation based upon pretty much a Spanish instrument. You know, if you look at a piano, obviously a piano has come from, you know, European classical music. The drum kit is a hybrid of marching instruments, but with technology added. We got to give a shout out to the great New Orleans drummer who in the 1890s, D.D. Chandler, fashioned a bass drum pedal. He made a bass drum pedal, most likely so he could get the double fee. He could get paid for doing the bass drum and the snare drum at the same time. And people at the time, drummers, were amazed at the feat of coordination that Dee was doing. And then, you know, Ludwig comes on and goes, I wonder if I can make a commercial bass drum pedal, and the drum kit is born. Jazz is made out of all these integrated factors working together. If we go back to New Orleans pre-Buddy Bolden, I've just been watching a Buddy Bolden called The Great Inventor of Jazz, and I'm watching it and going, nobody knows what Buddy Bolden was up to, nobody knows what he sounded like. He worked for a certain amount of time. He had an incredible impression on New Orleans at the time. By talking to people, we have an idea that he had this very loud sound. He had a very charismatic personality. He seemed to, exude charisma, and he improvised, right? So people go, oh yeah, but that's what the big difference is with Buddy Bolden. He was improvising. But as I've said, musicians have always improvised. I think that in New Orleans, pre-Buddy Bolden, what you had is you had sophisticated classical musicians playing this music, and they were earning. And then down below, on a lower level, right, less pay, not as good gigs, you had other musicians who were attempting to play, and they were almost like buskers, and they were playing head music. They were playing from their heads. They were playing by ear. And that's where the incredible innovation happens. But it's more complex than that as well, because you've got to remember that with people buying up cornets and clarinets, they would have gone and got lessons. Now, there's a clarinetist, early jazz clarinetist called Lorenzo Tio, and he came from it was a Mexican family, I think, but they brought in specific techniques, virtuoso techniques on how to play that instrument. If we then fast forward to someone like Sidney Bechet, who's another musician that's right at the beginning that we can actually hear because he recorded, he had lessons from the Tio family. He was a contemporary of Lorenzo Tio, and he took that sort of French clarinet style and put it onto soprano sax, right? And if you read the interviews with Sidney Bechet, and he says, well, where does jazz come from? he will go, well, it came from France. You know, if you read interviews at the time with Jelly Roll Morton, another guy that claimed to have invented jazz, and I believe has got a better claim to have invented jazz than Buddy Bolden. I really do. People seem to react to Jelly Roll Morton's claim that he invented jazz, and I think now that is being re-evaluated. I've listened to the interviews with Jelly Roll, and this idea that he was a very sort of arrogant, big-headed person that was boasting, he doesn't come across like that. At one point, if you read the interviews or listen to them, because there's some incredible interviews, or, you know, audio recordings of Jelly Roll talking, at one point he says that he had to slow down his piano style and change it because he just wasn't technically able to play like other New Orleans musicians. And what he brought in was a Spanish influence. You know, a lot of the early ragtime composers, when you read interviews with them, they say that a lot of those lines are coming in from, you know, it's a Sicilian influence, right? So when we step back, we go, well, jazz is made up of all sorts of things. So what is so special about jazz? Well, maybe it's what happens is you had all these, you know, black American musicians on New Orleans, and they took all these things, and maybe all the things do come from all these different areas, but they put it together. But that's not the case either. If we go back to the early jazz groups pre-Buddy Bolden, there is obviously a hell of a lot of, you know, black bands playing at that time. Incredible bands, and this is why I've just mentioned D.D. Chandler. D.D. Chandler was a black drummer who is so important to the history of jazz. That single guy we can point to and definitely say, if he hadn't have done that, we wouldn't have the thing that sat behind me, which is why I positioned this behind me, you see. But you had people like Papa Jack Lane, who was running integrated bands. You had white jazz groups, obviously, or pre-jazz groups, because of course it wasn't called jazz there. And there's a big argument going on about what about the word jazz and where that comes from, and nobody knows where that word comes from. We can get into all that, and in the future I'll get into where does the word jazz come from. But what we have with Papa Jack Lane is the evidence of integration. A lot of the musicians Buddy Bolden was working with, and the original Dixieland Jazz Band, those two early groups have their history with Papa Jack Lane. Jelly Roll Morton, if you read interviews with him, he talks about a lot of Native American bands in early New Orleans music. This is one of the great shames, and this is really why I'm doing this video. The importance and influence of Native Americans on jazz has not been put in the history books, but there is a very, very strong Native American influence, and some of the rhythms that we hear in jazz could well come from Native American music. Now, I've spoken to people who are much more knowledgeable than me on this, and I will try and bring them on the channel. And so this contemporary lens of trying to, do what I find a very territorial thing, an exclusive thing of going, jazz is black American music. That is great for black people, and I understand that, And on this channel here, I am so happy to be able, in a really neutral way, to champion the genius of black jazz musicians, right? And I wish to do that in a way which does not point to their blackness, that puts them up against everybody else that's ever existed in the whole history of art and music, and goes, these people are up there, and in some cases surpass anybody in human history, which I believe is the case. And so, as much as we want to champion that cause, we don't want to then negate another, minority group, the indigenous population of America, which is Native Americans. It seems, it's counterintuitive to me. So here we have, so there's a whole melting pot of people. Black American musicians play the key part in the creation of this music. So you could say, well, Andy, why don't you just, because it's so important, why don't you just say, well, call it black? And I'm happy to do that, and I accept that, except I believe it negates what these musicians did. Because this jazz music is not territorial. This BAM thing, British, Black American, I nearly said British American music then, that would be the Beatles, wouldn't it? Black American music, this Nicholas Payton thing, to me, is trying to go, look, well, we're in control of this music because it's our music. Now, if you're going to make that statement, then you start to say, well, why is it? Why is it your music? And I've tried to establish a little bit of kickback there. Not to deny the achievements of black musicians, not at all. The reason is because what those musicians did goes beyond that, and it throws the baby out with the bathwater. It denies that aspect of what jazz does, which is incredible. And what jazz does is it takes all these elements that are in America, because jazz is basically American music, right? And it embodies in the way it integrates that. It basically is a music form that says anybody can play this. Come on, and everybody can bring what you think in, bring some of that marching music. You bring the blues in here. Bring some of that Spanish music, and it creates a form that integrates, that opens its arms up to America, and creates an American music form. And this form embodies in it a lot of the sort of democratic aspects, the stuff that's written into the American Constitution, I suppose. This idea of these liberal ideas of acceptance and people being able to do their own thing, but not like upset the people around them, and that sort of negotiation that happens between people that makes America a great country. Of course, all that stuff comes from Britain. Of course, it's all our great Enlightenment liberal philosophers that forged your Bill of Rights and Declaration of Independence and all that. But I won't go there, because then I'm trying to claim it for me, aren't I? Which is a bloody rotten thing to do. It's just a rotten thing to do. Oh, if you go back in history, my race was had a part in doing this, so I can claim a little bit of that, can't I? No, because it wasn't me doing it. It was people that are dead and gone. It's not us. It's not us. Right? Jazz embodies that, but it embodies that in a time in America where, despite the fact that it was professing that every person is born equal and all this type of stuff, that they weren't behaving like that. They were actually going, yeah, but these people, stick them down there. I know. We won the Civil War and we've abolished the slavery, but let's bring some of these Jim Crow rules in there. Let's just keep them down. We're going to give it a good 100 years before we're going to let anybody complain about it, and then it's going to be a bloody big deal. That is the crucible in which jazz is born, right? And what's special about it is not that this music form is a black music form created by black musicians, and it's all these innovations are so incredible that when we spot harmonic devices that Charlie Parker's using, and then we look at Chopin, we go, so Chopin must have been a jazz musician because these guys created all this. It doesn't work like that. It's not like that at all. So what is it that jazz does? If it's not improvisation, if it's not like 2-5-1s and all these weird scales, and if it's not all these elements, and it's not even the rhythm. Now, I've done this on this channel over and over again, and I know it's more nuanced. I have always tried to not necessarily define jazz. I don't think we can define jazz, and I'm going to get into this at the end of the video. But I have tried to say these are the specific things that jazz innovates. It's not this aspect of harmony or this and this. It's these three elements, and one of them is the idea of groove, funkiness. Stuff that you like to shake your butt to, which often gets called swing. Now, is there other music that has got that sort of feeling? Well, I get that feeling from Indian classical music. The tabla playing seems to have a groove. We're not just about keeping time. We're not about a waltz that makes you want to dance. We're about something that is inherent in the rhythm, which is lower down. And it's got a certain gravity, visceral gravity about it. But I could question even that as something that comes from jazz, that originates from jazz. So the other thing would be improvisation. Well, I think the thing that's specific about improvisation, and this this comes about because of recording. These headbands that are just played by ear that were exist in New Orleans, it was possibly the case that they were all embellishing the music by ear all at the same time. It was collective improvisation. Once recording comes along and you get a supreme genius like Louis Armstrong or Jelly Roll Morton walk into a recording studio, they start to organise it and they create the solo. Right, we then have the solo. So I think it's the integration of improvisation in a composition which is inherent. So it has to have improvisation in to be that tune. Right, that is what jazz is. But of course we also have that in Indian classical music. The last one I've always stated is the idea of the individual voice. I think that's the one thing that jazz does, which I can't think of any other music form does. So yeah, Indian classical music's got it all down, but if you're learning sitar, you're going to learn to phrase and play and get a tone, which is sort of predictable. You can't change it. Right? If you're playing folk music, we all know that if you listen to a folk singer, they all sort of do the same thing. There's a way of doing it. Jazz isn't like that. In jazz, you could sound however you want. That's the great innovation of jazz. That you come in with your voice unadulterated. You can be a brilliant jazz singer and sound like Bessie Smith. Or you can be a brilliant jazz singer and sound like Billie Holiday. And they are poles apart. Right? Individuality, individual expression. That is what jazz is about. Right? And that is why it is such a high music art form, because it expresses the inner humanity of someone. It exposes that to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world go, oh my God, I can feel that person's humanity. Now imagine putting that in the hands of genius black American musicians, right? Then we start to see a much more nuanced way of approaching jazz. So then you could say, well, Andy, now you've sort of said it, maybe jazz was made out of all these different things. Maybe all different musicians played a part in its development, and maybe this sort of revisionist view that sees that the original Dixieland jazz band were just, the sort of white world picking on a white group to record first because they didn't want to record the proper originators of jazz. This is not true. People had tried to record Freddie Keppard before, who was a brilliant early jazz trumpeter player, and he didn't want to be recorded. And if you go back to interviews with Louis Armstrong, you will see interviews where he was saying that the musicians involved in the original Dixieland jazz band were some of the finest musicians in New Orleans, and the original Dixieland jazz band he describes as the first orchestra of jazz. He has high praise for this very good New Orleans group. Right? And I know people are saying, yeah, but they got it from black musicians. Did they? Which musicians did they get it from? Because that group came out of Papa Jack Lane's group, which is in the 1890s, which is an integrated band. Now, where were they getting it from? Now, all I want is the evidence for you to tell me who the musicians are that originated that. And I know you can't, because they're not there. Okay? All sorts of musicians originated this form. The great geniuses of it that don't come in till later. Jazz is I'm going to have to deal with the word jazz on this video. This is going to be a long video. This is going to be way longer than that video that asks whether Chopin is jazz or not. Sorry, I didn't expect to go down this avenue, but I know I've got to deal with it. I'm in discussions and conversations with people that are pushing against me on this all the time. And I have a number of reasons of holding my ground, and I'm trying to explain it on this video. And it's exposed the idea that there's some novelty of saying, oh, Chopin's like jazz. It seems preposterous to me. Okay, it seems ridiculous. Because obviously, especially musicians in the early 20th century would be listening to certain popular composers and taking from it. That's why that's there. Okay? we start to argue about the word jazz. Now, the great argument from the sort of black American music fraternity is that that word wasn't made by black people. It wasn't created by black people. It's the white the white music world's label put on it to sell it. Well, to some extent that's true, but the problem is every single label that is put on music is there to sell it, right? There are two ways, I think, well, three ways of selling music. Once you get into commercial music, and of course, if the original Dixieland Jazz Band hadn't sold 1 million copies of that record. Now, do you want to know why that got recorded? I'll tell you why. It's because down in New Orleans there was no recording equipment, no recording studios. They did not exist, right? The original Dixieland Jazz Band was one of these bands that came out and went up to Chicago. Lee Armstrong did it with King Oliver. There was an exodus to Chicago, but there wasn't really any recorded stuff in Chicago. And then original Dixieland Jazz Band got a residency in New York where there was recording equipment. And someone decided to record it because they thought it would make a great novelty song. It was recorded because people saw it as a novelty, but it wasn't a novelty. It had some X factor in there that no one was ready for. And when that record came out, it sold millions of records. And so the recording industry went, well, let's sign up some more of this. And within a few years, musicians of all sorts of races were being recorded. All sorts, right? Now, was there racism towards the black musicians? Yeah, of course there was. Racism has always existed, and it always will exist. And all we can do is our best to counteract it. But again, we don't counteract racism with more racism. Okay, so for me, the fraternity out there that is saying this is black American music, that is territorial, that is exclusive, right? The word jazz, we don't know where it comes from. And my belief is that the word jazz was used to describe musicians who improvised, that played from their head, ear players. That's what I think it was. There's all sorts of different definitions. When I was a kid reading on the encyclopedia, it was like made out to be a derogatory term. It was like a sexual term. I don't think it was. That now people can see that there was a very early use of the word jazz to describe a ball that you throw and it spins in baseball. I think there's that. I don't think anybody really knows, right? But I think, and I've read a lot about this, and I've read this a couple of times. This one seems to make sense to me. There were sophisticated reading, classically trained musicians that were playing this marching music. They could get there and read. Then there was other musicians lower down in their eyes, lower down the scale, that couldn't read, that were getting those lower gigs, and they were playing it by ear. And I think the musicians above, say, would go, oh, they're just jazzing it. They're jazzing it. And I've got no proof of that. But the point is that is as feasible as anything else, right? Whatever word was grabbed by the commercial white music industry is the word that would have been used to denote any style of music. Right, now what's really interesting, if you take a style like bluegrass has as much black American influence in it as does jazz. Right, now there's one thing in here that's, I think I do have to state, is ragtime is a very sophisticated popular music form that emerges in Scott Joplin in the 1860s. All right, Scott Joplin was a black composer, like W.C. Handy, a genius composer. Right, what was he doing? He was bringing a whole bunch of elements in together, but he was an incredible composer, groundbreaking composer, as was W.C. Handy. We need to point to those. The music tradition that I would say, if I was inclined to try and how can I say this, try and say that races own music, which I find really immoral, I suppose. But the blues, without doubt, the blues is a music form created by black American musicians. The blues is so important. Now, the reason why the blues is so important, because it's an incredibly expressive form and it's sophisticated in its way that it integrates the sacred and the secular. That's an incredible thing. The blues is something else. And the blues is the sort of, black American, seam of gold that runs through jazz. And jazz holds its hands with the blues. And the music forms that dominate the 20th century that come from jazz really are jazz projected through rhythm and blues. So gospel, soul, rock and roll, rock music, and then reggae, funk are all rooted in the blues. Now, this is something that's hard to get now because as music history is advancing, if you look at popular music forms, they are moving more and more away from the blues. So when you listen to, say, Aretha Franklin or James Brown, that's just the blues. That's the blues. If we go to Michael Jackson is still, in the way he delivers and his history of that experience that is in his voice, it's the blues. But now we are moving away from that. We're not just moving away from that in popular music, but we're also moving away of that in jazz education. Where jazz education is actually focusing on these Western European devices and getting into all these Chopin chords. Right? We are moving away from the blues, but the blues is where that is. Buddy Bolden, and we don't know what he sounds like, and we're guessing at it. But I think from what I've read, all the stuff I've read, that what Bolden was doing was integrating the blues into this marching music form. Right? The blues is incredibly sophisticated, but it's also quite simple in a way. Musicians can learn the blues, and this is what happened in the 1960s in the UK, in London, is sort of, white male middle class, musicians started to play the blues, and they found a way of expressing themselves with 3 chords, a pentatonic scale, a couple of bends, and the truth. Like when he goes through, he said, 3 chords and the truth. That's what was brought in. That's what really creates rock music, which that creates heavy metal. When I was at music college, and I used to teach music history back in the old days, I used to say to someone, who's your favourite band? And we put the band on the board and we go, right, they say, my favourite band's Slipknot. So write Slipknot, say who's Slipknot, influenced by, and they go, I don't know. We eventually come up with, say, Black Sabbath. Well, who was Black Sabbath influenced by? And then we suddenly realised that Ozzy was into soul music, that Tony Iommi was into Django Reinhardt. They go, Django Reinhardt, yeah. So, and straight away we're back to jazz. Then we would look at the very sort of that heavy, dark aspect of Black Sabbath. And then we could trace that back to Howlin' Wolf, and then Howlin' Wolf we could trace back to Charlie Patton, and then we get to Charlie Patton, we're at the blues, and we can't go any further because we then move into that mysterious world that we are all arguing about now, that nobody really knows about. Okay, the blues is so important, and it's the fact that musicians, rock musicians, can express themselves very deeply with a minimal of harmonic material means that when they start to advance, they then hit that jazz. Now, I'm at the beginning of the video now, right? The great innovation of blues democratizes popular music. The very fact that there are musicians that in later life move from, playing Cream tracks or Hendrix tracks and then suddenly want to play a Charlie Parker track and they go, how the hell do we do this? And then they have to start studying the classical aspects, the European compositional aspects, because European classical music is incredibly advanced. It's incredibly hard to play, right? But the worst thing of this, and this is the racist part of this, is for us European white people to believe something's worthwhile because it takes from classical music is wrong. It denies the truth of the blues. It denies the brilliance of those musicians. It denies the brilliance of all jazz musicians because they have something else in there. Something else that expresses something else, and it was new, and it emerged at a time when recording technology was at a point. Now you've got to remember this. I was looking at a video the other day, and it says Buddy Bolden didn't get recorded because recording equipment didn't exist at that time. The recording industry was was very small, and they did no. Caruso at the very same time was selling millions of records. The records industry was up and going. They didn't record it because this silly little quaint local music form that was down in the south of America, the USA, didn't seem to be worth recording. It wasn't until the original Dixieland Jazz Band arrived in New York and people went, oh, that might be able to make a novelty song out of that. You have to understand the history of jazz and where it comes from. And we have to stop treating it with kid gloves, and we have to stop looking at it through the lens of contemporary identity politics. We have to talk about it in reality of what it is, and in some cases say we just don't know. We don't know what Buddy Bolden sounded like. We don't really know what was going on in New Orleans. We can't assume that this racial group or identity group were responsible for this or this or this. All we know is there was a melting pot. It was a port city, like Liverpool in the 1960s and 50s. It's a port city. There was lots of things coming in, and it all got integrated. And what's incredible is the integration and the way it was integrated. That is what makes jazz such an incredible art form. Now, I have to say as well that I believe that the greatest artists of the 20th century, forgetting race, their greats are Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Charlie Mingus, Thelonious Monk, Bill Evans, Benny Goodman, Bix Beiderbecke, Dave Brubeck. That's what I think is jazz created these incredible artists, and it's the individual achievement of each of those artists we need to look at. Louis Armstrong is like the polar opposite of Duke Ellington. Louis Armstrong is a guy that came from the streets, that he ended up in a waif's home. And it was only because some guy was kind enough to hand him a clarinet that his genius was able to emerge, and he became a highly sophisticated musician. Not just some innate genius that just happened to be able to play. This guy was a sophisticated musician that was able to take this, at that point, relatively unsophisticated sort of folk form, local folk form, weird folk form, and turn it into art. Duke Ellington came from a middle-class educated family. He had a scholarship to go to university to study art. When he was a kid, he used to play baseball, and Theodore Roosevelt, the president of America, used to go down and watch him play. He was in that world, a different world to Louis Armstrong. Louis always wanted to entertain. Louis always wanted to be there and please the people because he had to at one point to stay alive. To survive. Duke Ellington wanted to turn jazz into an art form because that is where he had come from, right? They're different people. They've got different approaches to the music. And that is true of all the great artists. We need to treat them individually. Now, yeah, we have this word jazz. And as with all genre names, it's not sufficient to really bind in everything. There's always stuff on the edge. That's the way it is. It's only there to sell. That's right. But every single label is only there to sell. All right? That's the way it is. I'm a progressive rock musician or a prog musician. I don't like the word prog. Prog? I mean, prog, it sounds like some creature on a TV show in the 1970s that would live in like a rubbish tip. That's what prog is. Okay? I don't like that name. It's a name given to a certain type of music, and you can come up with sort of rules, but there's always music in the edge of it, and believe me, prog is worse than jazz. All we do is argue about the limits of prog. Is this prog? Is that prog? Casey and the Sunshine Band, are they prog? keeping your socks in order, keeping them all lined up in order, in colour order in your drawer. Is that prog? You know, this is how stupid it is. It's enjoyable, it's nice to have the conversation, but it's stupid. Really. And so when I see some people trying to say jazz is a black American art form, if black people should have this, this and this, what it does, and if I don't want to get into heavy philosophy here, but how does this work? Because we've now got the term black. Now, the term black is definitely a binding term which is fluid. I am not 100% white because my mum's Indian. But most people aren't 100% white. So how could they be? Most black people in America have been there and their ancestors go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Most black people aren't 100% black. It's a big mishmash of people. So how are we going to define this? Are we going to say the more black you are, the more you have a right to own this music form? It starts to sound like fascism to me. It starts to sound like racial separatism to me. It starts to sound racist to me. Now, I'm not accusing anybody who says it as being a racist. I don't think they are racist, but I think that it's because, and I might be wrong. They might come and say, "No, Andy, you've got this wrong here. You're seeing it wrong," and that might be my Eurocentric viewpoint, my white Eurocentric viewpoint. Might mean that I don't see it straight. And I admit that. I'm not some sort of dogmatic ideologue that thinks what I'm saying is true. I'm having this conversation to have the conversation. But believe me, I've been having this conversation for 35, 40 years. Right? So these aren't just wild opinions I'm coming up with. This has developed over years. I've had arguments with people about this, and I have won those arguments over and over again because I'm making a reasonable point here, surely. But the problem is there is a certain lens which this is being seen through at the moment, and it colours the history. And I didn't want to use that term, but I'm afraid I have. It colours the history of jazz, right? I never thought when I set this channel up that I would be involved in this discussion. But as soon as I did and I started to talk about jazz, I became aware that I was self-censoring. There's certain places I just didn't want to go there. Didn't want to go and get into this sort of identity. I knew deep down that I felt that to claim that a certain group has essentialist moral hierarchies is wrong. It's just wrong to me. I might be wrong and I'm open to a counter argument, and that's the whole point. I am open to the counter argument. And if someone changes my mind now, as I said, you go back to the early videos on this channel and there I am saying, music is, jazz is a black music form created by black people, blah, blah, blah. I have had to change my opinion through cogent, logical arguments that have been backed up by evidence. That's the only reason. If some people come for me, I will change my mind again. And then you'll say, well, have you got a right to come on and say things that aren't true? Right, we're negotiating that. There's a journey. If you come and see this channel, it's 500 viewers, there's a journey. Okay? The philosophical argument for of being a black person, saying I'm a white person, and even though my mum's Indian, even though my family members do experience racism, I don't experience racism because I'm white, right? But direct family members very close to me would not consider themselves white. It seems preposterous, but that's the way it is, and that's how racism works. My mum, when she came to the UK from India in the 1940s, experienced extreme racism that completely altered the course of her life. My mum. But I don't. Because my whiteness is phenomenological, right? Now, phenomenology is the idea that truth is based upon our lived experience, our subjective experience. And so the argument would be, well, I'm white because I feel that I'm white. And you're black if you're black because you feel that you're black, your own personal experience. Now, the problem with that is I have a difficulty with phenomenology because it tries to create truth categories. Now, truth categories are categories that we identify things as being true and false by from personal experience, and I think that's the antithesis of what a truth category is. And I don't think the philosophers that have pushed that. There is a local use to a phenomenological assessment of the world philosophically, but it is limited, and there are certain points where when you start to push it to these areas, it starts to break down. Okay, so once you've identified this group that doesn't actually exist, it exists essentially from people's lived experience. And that is what you get when people argue with me. They will go, you do not understand the lived experience of a black person in the USA, which of course I don't. But from that personal subjective experience, can we create defined truth categories such as black or white? Especially when we know factually we are pointing to a group which is fluid, right? That does not have an edge. Factually, it can't be denied, it does not have an edge, right? Once we start to base truth on that, we get into a terrible situation where certain groups can claim a moral hierarchy based upon their own subjective view that they belong to this group. I'll give you an example of some people who did that. The Nazis. You know. And so I distrust it now. I feel that sometimes I'm getting attacked and people are saying, yeah, but you shouldn't be saying this, Andy. And I'm supposed to sit there going, well, no, but to me, if you are going to have a phenomenological, you're going to deny what I'm saying as being a much more objective philosophical approach, then what I'm saying becomes my lived experience. So the only argument is my lived experience is less valid than someone else's lived experience based upon the idea that of my race, which in the end seems to have no bearing on it, because as I said, I do have relatives who are Indian and who have experienced racism and are quite close, my mum. Doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. When you watch that video, because you're probably sat there going, my God, this is an hour-long reaction to a video that was about 10 minutes long, that was just a nice little video just explaining how Chopin did some stuff that sounded a little bit like jazz, and that's all they were trying to do, and I agree. But I feel that the basic premise of the video is based upon, wow, Chopin sounds like jazz. No. You can make it much simpler by saying jazz sounds like Chopin. Why? Because it came after. And jazz is a music form like everyone else, which takes its influences from all over the place, and all different musicians have integrated all different styles of music. It is just a style of music. So how are you going to define it? It's really hard to define. I've just spent an hour doing it, and I came back to the idea of, because it presents an individual expression which expresses itself through improvisation, through grooviness, and through having a personal voice. Maybe that's what jazz is so special. It's those three elements being utilised for individual person expression. Personal expression, freedom of expression, is as important for a reasonable culture and society as freedom of speech. We must allow people to express themselves. We must. And if somebody was to turn around and say these BAM lot, the British, I've done it again, the Black American music lot, that is an expression of a certain experience, I would be wholeheartedly with them. We saw that in the 60s after the civil rights movement really got in. We saw black American musicians reclaiming their African heritage. So if someone was asked, is African music and African culture in the art ensemble of Chicago? Oh yes. This is one of the great things that black American musicians, jazz musicians did, was to reclaim that for those people who were interested in expressing a personal history that had been denied them by the history of American slavery. Right? This is all wonderful stuff, but we have to see it and see it in the boundary of personal expression. Right? And we have to be very careful in creating truth categories, binding truth categories, and then basing moral hierarchies on those truth categories, because it only ends in one place, and that is sort of totalitarianism. And if there's one thing jazz has always been used as the antidote against, it's totalitarianism. Please don't let jazz go there. Please! An hour of me going on. I do apologise. I do apologise for this video. I was chatting to someone the other day, and they said they were a fan of my channel, and they said they enjoyed the stuff I did. They said one day I got into a rant, and they said, and when they heard my rant, they went, "Oh, I got to subscribe to this channel." You guys like a rant. You know me. I'm a contrarian, right? This beehive of jazz is sitting there buzzing in front of me, and I have to sit there and I think, shall I kick it off? If I kick it, it's going to come right back at me. But I want to kick it. Yeah, but you shouldn't kick it. But I want to kick it, and I kick it, and that's what I've just done. So I hope I've explained my case. I hope I don't care whether you agree with me or not. I really don't. I enjoy having the conversation. If you don't agree with me, let's have a great conversation. I'm putting my arms out to the world. I really am. I'm putting my arms out to you all and trying to give you a big hug. And let's have a chat. And I could definitely be wrong. I could be just some white middle-aged Eurocentric, guy that doesn't realise I'm a racist. Yeah, I don't think you know you're a racist, Andy, but I think deep down it's unconscious bias. That's what I got. Unconscious bias. Right? This is a bias that you only have when you're unconscious. My bias is to be flat and horizontal, right? And then waking up to go to the toilet every few hours. That's my unconscious bias. Unconscious bias. What the hell is the unconscious? Is this a Freudian idea of the unconscious? People bandy these terms around, and you're not allowed to question the terms. But anyway, I hope I'm not that, and I hope people understand that I am not arguing this because there's some secret desire to try and make jazz white. Oh, God. If anyone knows me and knows what I have grown up with, and the most important thing to me in terms of my personality and what I've done in my life, I can only put my hands together and thank a whole bunch of musicians for me being here. John Coltrane, Miles Davis, John McLaughlin, Frank Zappa. They're the four musicians that have formed me as I am. Right? And my respect and love for their music and what they've done is unbounded. Absolutely unbounded. I can't tell you, I'm not here to try and, whitewash jazz. I'm here because it's the opposite. I think in seeing the history as people do and their dogmatic unquestioning of it, which I saw on that video, as great as that video was, European harmony mixed with African rhythms. They're not African rhythms, it's not European harmony, right? Because the blues is in that harmony. The blues. And Chopin, for all they just played, he never played a bloody microtonically off, bent, flat third over a major chord. Never heard it once. I never heard that sort of bend to the fourth, up to the flat five, to the flat five. I didn't hear any of that. Right? I didn't hear that vibrato. The vibrato that reaches into your soul and expresses your wonder and of being alive, and yes, the suffering of being alive at the same time. A sound that everybody, because we all suffer, can buy into. That's in the harmony as well. Oh my God. Yeah, bloody long video, isn't it? I've got here my jazz cap. This is a sort of hat that the early jazz musicians may have worn when they were doing their early jazz. When I put it on, I don't think I look that much like an early jazz musician though, do I? I look like a 1970s Northern comic. Now, they were racist. Englishman and Irishman walk into a pub. Right. And a Scotsman. I can't deliver the comedy like that. I can't deliver it. If you like this video, then press the like button. And if you want to see more of this, press subscribe. If you're upset by some of the stuff I've said, I have tried to make it up by wearing a hat at the end. See, I'm basically an idiot, remember that. And so if you like these aspects as well, subscribe. Look, I bet I'm going to look French like this. That look that's got a touch of the Joe Zawinul's about it, hasn't it? I think for me, the backwards cap is definitely the way to go. If you want to support me so I can buy more hats to make this even a more entertaining experience for you, then you can support me by becoming a Patreon and going and seeing all the wonderful content that we've got there. And I say we because my patrons are involved in creating that content, not just me. But if you don't want to do that and you just want to support me with a little gift, you can go to my PayPal tip jar. All the links are down below. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.